During the wedding, my daughter-in-law said she didn't need my opinion, just my money. So I toasted with her and went straight to cancel the honeymoon in Paris. This is my story of betrayal, manipulation, and how I reclaimed my voice when they tried to make me disappear. Like, subscribe, and let me know where you're watching from. The ticking of Edward's vintage watch filled my studio as I traced my finger along the blueprints spread across my desk. 7 years since the accident took him, and sometimes I still turn to share a thought with him. This watch, the last valuable family heirloom I hadn't sold to help James, kept me company in the silence. The doorbell interrupted my reverie. I wasn't expecting visitors, especially not my son. James rarely came by anymore since taking that teaching position at the community college that he abandoned for his entrepreneurial ventures. "Mom," he announced, standing in my doorway with a petite blonde woman. "This is Amber Collins. We're getting married in 6 months." I struggled to keep my expression neutral. James had never mentioned being in a serious relationship since his painful divorce from Lauren 5 years ago. "It's lovely to meet you," I managed, extending my hand. "This is quite a surprise. We met online," James explained. His arm wrapped possessively around Amber's waist. "We've been talking for over a year before meeting in person." Amber's eyes scanned my home. The vaulted ceilings, the custom woodwork, all my own designs. There was something calculating in her gaze that made me uneasy. Over dinner, James fidgeted with his napkin. "We're trying to figure out the wedding budget. Venues in Boston are so expensive these days." "I'd be happy to help," I offered. "I sold some properties after retirement that could cover a nice ceremony." Amber's eyes lit up instantly. "James mentioned you were an incredible architect. You must have designed amazing projects." The conversation shifted dramatically. Suddenly, Amber wanted to know everything about my career, but only after money entered the discussion. "How many properties did you design in your career, Margaret?" Amber leaned forward, her interest palpable. "Over 40 major projects," I answered, watching her calculate something behind her smile. Later that night, alone again, I found an old photograph in my drawer. Edward in his professor's jacket, James as a child, and me standing in front of our first home. I turned it over, reading Edward's handwriting. "To the woman who built not just buildings, but our entire family." My finger traced his words as something cold settled in my stomach. The woman at my dinner table wasn't interested in family. She was surveying assets. "What are you getting yourself into, James?" I whispered to the empty room. Edward's watch ticking steadily beside me, marking time as something shifted in my world, something I couldn't yet name, but could feel taking shape like an architectural flaw in what should have been a perfect structure. 3 months before the wedding, I showed Amber my meticulously organized album of wedding ideas I'd collected over the years. Fabric swatches, magazine clippings, detailed notes, all reflecting my training as an architect. "I thought about this while James was growing up," I explained, unable to hide the emotion in my voice. Amber smiled politely. "It's very traditional." A week later, visiting their apartment for lunch, I spotted my album discarded under a stack of magazines, completely untouched. That same afternoon, Amber introduced Vanessa, a luxury wedding planner she'd already hired without consulting me. "Vanessa worked on the Kardashians' wedding," Amber gushed, showing me elaborate digital mood boards on her tablet. "I'm helping finance the ceremony," I reminded her gently. "I'd like to be included in these decisions." James intervened immediately. "Mom, you're not familiar with modern weddings. Amber knows what works best nowadays." During the menu tasting, I found myself seated at a distant table, watching as Amber rejected the traditional Wilson family cake recipe. "We want something that photographs well for Instagram," she explained to the chef, not even glancing in my direction. That evening, James drove me home. We sat in his car, engine off, streetlights casting shadows across his troubled face. "Mom, I need to tell you something," he began, fingers tapping anxiously on the steering wheel. "I've had some financial setbacks." "What kind of setbacks?" I asked carefully. "Failed business ventures. And I developed a problem with online betting after the divorce." He couldn't meet my eyes. "I haven't told Amber. She thinks I'm more successful than I am." My heart sank. "How bad is it, James?" "I was hoping you might invest in my new business idea after the wedding," he said quickly. "This one will be different, I promise." I watched my son, 38 years old, and still making the same impulsive decisions that worried Edward so much. When had he become so adept at avoiding responsibility? or had I simply been unwilling to see it? We'll discuss it after the wedding, I said finally, gathering my purse to leave. As I reached for the door handle, James caught my arm. Thanks, Mom. You've always been there for me. His words should have warmed me, but instead they landed like a weight on my shoulders. I'd always been there for him. That was true. But as I climbed the steps to my empty house, I wondered if being there for James had somehow enabled him to avoid standing on his own. Your father believed in your potential, I whispered to myself, remembering how Edward, despite his quiet academic nature, had always tried to instill responsibility in our son. But I'm starting to wonder if I've been believing enough for both of us. It was a beautiful shower at the Four Seasons, Vivian said, confusion creasing her forehead. Weren't you invited? My teacup froze halfway to my lips. What shower? Amber's bridal shower last weekend. Everyone assumed you'd declined because of your reading group. My reading group meets on Thursdays, not Saturdays. I'd received no invitation. When I confronted James that evening, he seemed genuinely surprised. Amber said you declined because of a schedule conflict. The next day, Amber appeared at my door with a bouquet of white lilies. There was a terrible misunderstanding with the digital invites, she explained with a perfect smile. Technology can be confusing for people your age. I accepted the flowers and her thinly veiled insult, but something had changed. This was the first explicit lie I'd caught, but was it James's or Amber's? At the wedding rehearsal, now budgeted at $180,000 after necessary adjustments from the original $120,000, the photographer positioned me consistently away from the main family group. The photos will be more harmonious this way, she explained, clearly following specific instructions. At the rehearsal dinner I'd arranged and paid for at a historic Boston restaurant, Amber looked around with barely concealed disdain. It's so antiquated, she commented, loud enough for her friends to hear. But I suppose it suits certain generations. Her friends laughed, looking directly at me. Later, heading to the restroom, I overheard Amber's voice from around the corner. The old lady has way more money than we thought, she was saying into her phone. James says she sold valuable properties in recent years. After the wedding, we'll start phase 2. I froze, my hand against the wall to steady myself. I'll call you back, Amber said quickly, sensing my presence. We stood facing each other in the narrow hallway, the mask of politeness slipping for just a moment before she reconstructed it. Just confirming details with the florist, she said brightly, sliding her phone into her clutch. I nodded, unable to speak, past the tightness in my throat. As I walked back to the table, James raised his glass in my direction, smiling. I tried to return the smile, but something had irrevocably broken inside me, something that even the best architect couldn't repair with mere goodwill and hope. I took a deep breath and steadied myself. I needed clarity, not emotion, to navigate what was unfolding. The structural engineer in me recognized that sometimes you need to thoroughly examine the damage before you can begin to rebuild. On the morning of the wedding, I carefully prepared my mother's pearl necklace, wrapping it in a blue velvet box as something borrowed for Amber. When I delivered it to the bridal suite, Amber barely glanced at the heirloom. Thanks, but I already have professionally selected jewelry to match the dress. She handed the box to a bridesmaid without opening it. Maybe next time. Her bridesmaids exchanged glances, one suppressing a smirk. During the lavish $200,000 ceremony, after an additional $20,000 in last-minute emergencies James had requested the previous week, I noticed how the wedding reflected nothing of the Wilson family. No traditions, no references, not even a mention of Edward. At the reception, after several glasses of champagne and encouraged by Vivian, I timidly suggested including a traditional Wilson family dance. Amber, visibly irritated at being interrupted while conversing with influential guests, responded loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear, "Margaret, dear, I don't need your opinion, just your money." This was followed by an artificial laugh and a, "Just kidding, of course," that convinced no one. An uncomfortable silence fell over the group. I sought James's gaze, but he was busy checking his phone, deliberately avoiding the confrontation. What a shame, an elderly guest murmured as I walked away, trying to maintain my composure. I retreated to a quiet corner, hands trembling slightly as I sipped water to clear my head. "Are you all right?" Vivian asked, finding me there. "I've been a fool," I whispered. "No, Margaret. You've been a mother," she corrected, squeezing my hand. "But perhaps it's time to be Margaret Wilson again, the woman who designed the Boston Riverfront Museum and won the Architectural Digest Award. Her words struck something dormant inside me. When had I last thought of myself as that woman? The accomplished architect, not just James's supportive mother or Edward's grieving widow? I straightened my shoulders and returned to the reception with Vivian, raising my glass for a polite toast to the newlyweds, my voice only slightly trembling. To your happiness. As I circulated through the reception, fragments of conversations reached my ears, Amber enthusiastically describing the 3-week Paris honeymoon I was financing, including Ritz accommodations and Michelin-starred dinners. The mother-in-law is bankrolling everything, Amber commented to a friend, unaware of my proximity. It's the least we could get considering what we scored in wedding gifts. My champagne glass nearly slipped from my fingers, but I caught it, just as I caught myself before reacting. This was neither the time nor the place, but soon, I promised myself, watching them dance beneath crystal chandeliers paid for with my life's work. Soon. I noticed Edward's vintage watch gleaming on James's wrist as he spun Amber around the dance floor. At least that tradition had been preserved, even if nothing else had. As I prepared to leave the reception, I noticed Edward's vintage watch, which I'd lent James to wear as a family tradition, was no longer on his wrist. "Where's your father's watch?" I asked as I said my goodbyes. "Probably in the hotel room," he answered distractedly, his tone unconcerned. "I took it off during photos. It's safe, don't worry." Something in his dismissive tone bothered me, but exhaustion was setting in after the emotional day. I made a mental note to follow up about it later. Driving home alone, my phone buzzed with a notification. James had removed the location-sharing app we'd installed 8 months ago after a frightening incident when he disappeared for 3 days during a relapse into online gambling. We'd found him in an Atlantic City hotel, having lost over $30,000 in a weekend, unshaven and reeking of alcohol. At the time, I'd only agreed to help him financially on the condition we maintain this temporary monitoring system for his safety. There had been no warning or discussion about removing the app, just this automatic notification. At home, emotionally and physically exhausted, I found an email from the bank alerting me to unusual account activity. When I checked, I discovered a $50,000 transfer to James and Amber's joint account made that morning, beyond the $200,000 already spent on the wedding and the $30,000 allocated for their honeymoon. Shocked, I tried calling the bank's emergency line, but it was already past midnight. I'd have to wait until morning to take action. Sleep eluded me as I tried to make sense of what was happening. At 8 a.m. sharp, I called the bank and learned how the transfer had been made. 3 months earlier, I had signed what I thought was a limited authorization for James to help with wedding-related payments. James, with his accounting background, had altered the documents for broader access. The bank manager explained that James had presented an apparently signed authorization for that day's transfer, a signature I recognized as forged when the document was emailed to me. I also discovered James had access to my banking app and had been intercepting verification codes, as I often asked for his help with complicated technology during the wedding preparations, a pattern that began when he helped with financial matters after Edward's death. As Edward's medical bills mounted in his final year, I'd given James power of attorney to help manage our finances, never fully revoking it after Edward passed. This wasn't the first incident. Over the past 2 years, I'd signed several documents James prepared during casual visits, always explaining they were just formalities or to facilitate wedding preparation. My trust in my son had prevented me from examining each paper carefully. When I confronted him by phone, James responded impatiently. "We needed extra for the honeymoon. The euro is high now, and Amber wants to shop in Paris." "You have so much money, Mom. What's the problem?" When I expressed discomfort about the forgery, James audibly sighed. "Don't complicate things. You have more money than you can spend at your age. Amber is so excited about Paris." I hung up and stared at my office wall, where my architecture degrees and awards hung. Beside them, a photo of me at 45, receiving a major award for a museum project, with Edward and teenage James proudly applauding. The image now seemed to belong to another life, another woman. The next morning, I scheduled a video conference with Joseph Miller, my personal attorney and friend of 4 decades. "Joey, I need your help protecting what remains of my estate." With his guidance, I immediately revoked all authorizations granted to James and requested a forensic investigation of financial movements over the past 2 years. Joseph also helped me file a police report about the forgery, though I asked not to proceed with criminal charges yet. While there's basis for criminal charges for forgery, Joseph explained, adjusting his glasses, we can keep the report as evidence while deciding next steps. I nodded. I want to reclaim my power first, Joey. Then we'll decide about legal consequences. The audit results were alarming. A series of unauthorized small transfers totaling nearly $100,000 beyond the wedding expenses. This is elder financial abuse, Margaret, Joseph stated gravely. It happens more than you imagine, even to brilliant people like you. I began utilizing the meticulous skills that made me a respected architect, creating a detailed map of financial manipulations, subtle humiliations, and behavior patterns. In my studio, I transformed an entire wall into a project for recovering my autonomy. Simultaneously, I dusted off lecture materials I'd prepared years ago, but never had the confidence to present. I contacted a local community center about offering a talk on accessible architecture for seniors. It was time to reclaim not just my finances, but my professional identity. At the center, I met Diana Reynolds, a retired therapist specializing in elder financial abuse, who immediately recognized the signs of manipulation in my withdrawn behavior. You're not the first brilliant person to be manipulated by someone you love, Diana commented gently after the lecture. And you certainly won't be the last to reclaim your power. Her words resonated deeply as I drove home, passing buildings I'd designed decades ago. I'd always understood structural integrity in architecture, how each element must support others, how imbalances lead to collapse. Somehow, I'd failed to apply those same principles to my family relationships. That evening, I received a text from James. Have you calmed down yet? Amber's talking about a house we love. We'll need help with the down payment. I stared at the message, remembering Diana's advice about establishing boundaries. Instead of responding immediately, I placed the phone face down on my desk and opened my computer. With methodical precision, I began transferring funds from my main accounts to new ones Joseph had helped establish, accounts James couldn't access. For the first time in years, I didn't rush to solve my son's problems. Instead, I returned to my wall of diagrams and added a new element: financial independence. Phase 1. My phone continued buzzing with messages from James, but I focused on my work, feeling something long dormant awakening inside me. The decisive, clear-minded architect who once commanded boardrooms and construction sites. That woman hadn't disappeared. She'd merely been buried under years of maternal accommodation and grief. Time to rebuild, I whispered to myself. Adding precise measurements to my diagram as outside my window, Boston's skyline, including 3 buildings I'd designed, glowed against the darkening sky. James and Amber arrived at Boston International Airport with newly acquired designer luggage, ready for their luxurious Parisian honeymoon. At the Air France counter, they were informed their reservations had been canceled. Confused and angry, they discovered there were also no reservations at the Ritz Paris. Desperate, they called me. I answered with surprising calm. As Amber made clear to everyone at the wedding, you only want my money, not my opinion. I decided not to offer either for now. James, caught between his furious wife and hurt mother, alternated between anger and pleading. We can't pay for this now. Everyone knows about this trip. I suggest using your credit card, I replied, with the same firmness I once used in project meetings. At 38, perhaps it's time to finance your own luxuries. I mentioned the location app. By the way, I noticed you removed our monitoring agreement, the one we established after finding you in that Atlantic City hotel last year. I suppose that means you no longer need my help in emergencies either. I had willingly paid the considerable cancellation fees for both the flights and hotel. It wasn't about the money. It was about establishing that my resources were no longer unconditionally available. The next day, I received an unexpected visit. Lauren, James's ex-wife. I saw the wedding photos on Instagram and recognized Amber Collins. I tried to warn James when they started dating 14 months ago, but he refused to listen. Lauren explained she'd met Amber 3 years earlier at a charity event. She was with another older man then, an executive. The pattern is always the same. She targets men with access to family money. Lauren revealed she'd tried several times to discuss her concerns with James. He was convinced I was just jealous. When I saw they married, I knew I needed to at least try warning you. She showed me screenshots from social media group conversations where women discussed experiences with Amber in Boston social circles, a consistent pattern of strategic relationships and financial manipulation. What really concerned me was when I learned she'd actually researched your family before, coincidentally, meeting James online, Lauren explained. She created a profile designed to appeal to him, knowing his interests and vulnerabilities from our marriage. I'm sorry I didn't try reaching you sooner, Lauren said, her expression pained. I thought about it, but I'm still James's mother. I finished her sentence. I understand. After Lauren left, I called Joseph to update my legal strategy. Then I contacted Diana to schedule another meeting. Finally, I called the community center director to confirm my next lecture. That evening, as I reviewed the screenshots Lauren had shared, I realized I was applying the same analytical approach I'd used when evaluating structural flaws in buildings. In architecture, identifying the problem is half the solution. The rest requires courage, creativity, and decisive action. I opened my laptop and began a new document titled Reconstruction Plan. As an architect, I'd always known that sometimes, to save a structure, you must first expose its damaged foundation, no matter how painful the process. My phone rang. James again. This time, I answered with steady resolve. Yes, I'll help you, but on my terms, not yours. We need to talk, all of us, including Lauren. Lauren? What does she have to do with anything? Everything, as it turns out, I replied, my voice stronger than it had been in years. My office. Tomorrow at 2 p.m. Don't be late. While James and Amber returned prematurely from a drastically reduced version of their honeymoon, 3 days in a budget hotel in Paris, not 3 weeks at the Ritz, I initiated a methodical transformation. I renovated my home office, unearthing designs I'd archived years ago. With Joseph's guidance, I began the process of partnering with an existing foundation dedicated to accessible housing for seniors, where I would serve as a consulting architect and board member while exploring the creation of my own initiative in the future. This will protect part of your estate and give you renewed purpose, he explained. When I accepted a consulting project to redesign a community shelter, continuation of work I'd started years ago but never finished, I rediscovered the satisfaction of creative work. Simultaneously, with Diana's support, I started a discreet support group for seniors who had faced family financial abuse, a problem more common than I'd imagined. 3 weeks after the wedding, James appeared unexpectedly at my door, alone and visibly stressed. Amber found the perfect house for us. We need help with the down payment. The property, he explained nervously, was far above their budget, but Amber had already told everyone about the purchase. Why isn't Amber here herself? I asked. James shifted uncomfortably. She tried calling you several times, but you didn't answer. She thought you might respond better to me. You know, mother and son. Instead of immediately refusing or yielding as I would have before, I proposed a formal meeting. Let's discuss all pending financial matters between us next week. Bring Amber and all relevant documents. And James, I also want to know what happened to your father's watch. His face paled. What do you mean? Edward's vintage watch, the one you were wearing at the ceremony but not at the reception. I told you, it's probably in the hotel room, he muttered, avoiding my gaze. Is it? I asked quietly, because I called the hotel's lost and found. Nothing was turned in. James shifted uncomfortably. I'll look for it. Do that, I said, stepping back from the door. And James, next time call before visiting. My schedule has become quite busy lately. As he walked back to his car, I noticed something different in his posture, a slight uncertainty that hadn't been there before. For years, he'd known exactly how I would respond to his needs, with immediate, unquestioning support. Now, that predictability was gone. Back in my office, I added his visit to my diagram wall, color-coding it under attempted financial manipulation. My phone buzzed with a text from Diana. How did it go? Phase 1 complete, I replied. Meeting scheduled for next week. Remember what we discussed, she texted back. Stand your ground. You're stronger than you realize. Looking up at my wall of diagrams, strategies, and evidence, I knew she was right. For too long, I'd been the foundation others stood upon without acknowledgement. Now I was building something new, a structure where my strength would serve my own life, not just others. Later that evening, Lauren called to check in. Did James come by today? Amber's been telling everyone about this house they're buying. Yes, he did. We're having a formal meeting next week. Do you want me to be there? She offered. I have documentation that might be useful. I considered it. Yes, I think that would be helpful. Thank you, Lauren. It was strange how the woman I once viewed as the cause of James's unhappiness was now becoming an ally in protecting us both. I transformed my dining room into an almost corporate environment for the meeting, organized documents, water and coffee formally arranged, and Joseph present as an old friend who was passing by. James and Amber arrived tense, she wearing expensive jewelry I'd never seen before. After serving the dinner I'd carefully prepared, I presented a folder to each of them. Before discussing any additional financial support, I'd like to share some recent decisions. With surgical precision, I revealed I'd initiated the process of partnering with an established foundation for accessible senior housing, contributing a significant portion of my estate, including half the value they expected for the house, to this organization where I would serve as lead architectural consultant. As a gesture of family goodwill, I'd established an anonymous scholarship for older women wishing to return to formal education. I initially thought of naming it after our family, I commented, but my attorney suggested keeping a neutral name to avoid legal complications. The contribution had generated positive coverage in the Boston Globe, which I subtly left on the table. Next, I presented a legal agreement. I would help with 30% of the house value, not the 70% they expected, but only if two conditions were met. First, James must return Edward's watch. Second, both must agree to 6 months of family therapy with a therapist of my choosing. Regarding the police report about the forgery, I informed them I'd decided to keep it as insurance, but didn't want to proceed with formal charges while exploring the possibility of family recovery through therapy. James, seeing determination in my eyes, reluctantly agreed. Amber, however, maintained her calculating facade for a few moments before realizing her usual strategy wasn't working. Her mask began to slip, not in an uncontrolled outburst, but in an attempt at more direct emotional manipulation. "Margaret, how can you not trust us after everything we did to include you? James feels devastated by your distrust." The emotional performance gradually escalated as I remained unmoved. Lauren, who had arrived midway through the meeting at my invitation, placed a folder on the table containing her documentation of Amber's pattern of behavior with previous men and families. As Amber saw the evidence mounting against her, and with Joseph quietly mentioning potential legal implications of financial exploitation, she finally cracked under pressure. "That old scratched watch? James told me it was worth very little. I had it appraised and sold it to buy something that actually matters." The room fell silent. James stared at his wife in horror. "You did what?" he whispered. "Don't act surprised," she snapped. "You knew I took it to get appraised. Getting appraised doesn't mean selling it." I exchanged glances with Joseph, who nodded slightly. We had anticipated this possibility. "How much did you get for it?" I asked calmly. $4,000, Amber muttered. "It wasn't even worth that much. The dealer said the internal mechanism was damaged." "That damaged mechanism was a custom-made Swiss movement from 1962, I said, my voice steady. "Edward's father had it specially made. The watch's insured value is $12,000. Amber's expression changed as she realized she'd been shortchanged and exposed. James stood up, his face ashen. "We'll find it," he promised. "We'll get it back." "Yes," I agreed, closing my folder. "You will." The first family therapy sessions began 2 weeks later and were tense, revealing deeply rooted toxic patterns. James using my guilt and loneliness after Edward's death to obtain financial support. Amber manipulating both of us with almost professional skill. Dr. Richardson, specialized in complex family dynamics, guided the sessions with compassionate firmness. Gradually, painful truths emerged. James had significant hidden debts from both impulsive investments and online gambling, a problem that started after his father's death. Amber, in turn, had a documented history of relationships with financially stable men and influential families, always following the same pattern of isolation and control. During the 6th therapy session, a turning point occurred when James revealed he'd found compromising messages between Amber and a wealthy client on her phone, suggesting more than a professional involvement. "She's doing to me exactly what she did to you," he admitted to me, finally recognizing the pattern Lauren had warned about. When Dr. Richardson directly asked James why he allowed me to be treated so poorly at the wedding, he finally articulated a deep resentment. She was always the successful one, always earning more than Dad, always being the great architect. He lived in her shadow, and I watched him pretend it was okay. This distortion of reality, Edward was actually a university professor, proud of his wife's achievements, was created in James's adolescence and never abandoned. I was shaken to realize how my professional strength had been reinterpreted as a failure. In parallel, without informing James or Amber, I hired a private investigator recommended by Joseph. Using information provided by Lauren about Amber's social circles, the investigator utilized Massachusetts's mandatory pawnshop registry and the watch's serial number, which I had documented for insurance, to track the item. After 3 weeks of thorough searching among 23 establishments in the region, the watch was finally located in a Cambridge pawnshop, where it had been sold for $4,200, still below its $12,000 value, but Amber had removed some original pieces, reducing its apparent value. I visited the shop personally and explained the situation to the owner, Mr. Goldstein. Touched by the story but still a businessman, he agreed to return the watch for $6,000, more than he paid, but significantly below the real value after restoration. "I'm not here to profit from family tragedies," he explained, "but I also need to maintain my business." As I left with Edward's watch safely in my purse, I felt a weight lifting, not just the recovery of a precious memento, but the reclamation of my own agency and discernment. That evening, as I carefully placed the watch on my workbench to begin researching restoration specialists, my phone rang. It was James. "The therapist suggested I call," he began awkwardly. "I wanted to say, I'm sorry, Mom, for everything. It wasn't enough, not yet, but it was a start." "Thank you for calling, James," I replied. "I'll see you at next week's session." After we hung up, I looked at the watch with its intricate mechanism exposed, damaged, but not beyond repair. Much like our relationship, it would take expertise, patience, and care to restore what had been broken, but it wasn't impossible. "We'll fix this, Edward," I whispered, gently closing the watch case. "Not just the timepiece, but our family too, though it may never be quite the same." A year later, I celebrated my 74th birthday in my renovated home. The space, once a monument to the past, now reflected my vibrant present. Half residence, half educational center, where I mentored seniors on financial independence and legal rights. My partnership with the Housing Foundation, where I served as lead architectural consultant, had expanded significantly. Our Architecture of Life initiative within the larger organization had already helped dozens of people regain their autonomy through thoughtfully designed living spaces. Edward's watch was back in its place of honor on the mantelpiece, expertly restored by a specialist watchmaker. In the months following the therapy revelations, as definitive evidence of Amber's affair came to light, the marriage quickly unraveled. I, now attentive to the signs, observed the familiar process of distancing, denial, and eventual legal separation, mirroring what Lauren had described years earlier. James, now legally separated from Amber after a contentious divorce process, was in his 8th month of individual therapy to address his gambling addiction and issues with female authority figures. Our reconciliation was a slow and imperfect process, but genuine. We now had lunch together every other week, gradually establishing a new dynamic based on mutual respect and clear boundaries. Regarding the police report about the forgery, I decided not to proceed with criminal charges, considering James's recovery journey sufficient consequence for now. As for Amber, she was already in a new relationship with an elderly real estate businessman, maintaining her predictable pattern. During my birthday celebration, I received surprising news. My community shelter project, started as therapy years ago but never finished, had finally been completed and recognized in the social impact design category. A validation Edward had always predicted I would receive. Making a brief thank you speech to my gathered friends, I looked at James, Diana, Joseph, Lauren, who had become a valuable friend, and the new members of my support group who had become part of my circle. For years, I allowed myself to become invisible because I confused love with sacrifice and care with erasure. I believed that to be a good mother, wife, and friend, I needed to diminish my own light. I paused, looking at Edward's watch, now working perfectly. Today, I know that true love never requires you to disappear. I invited everyone to see the plans for my ambitious new project within the foundation, an innovative housing complex for independent seniors combining sustainability and universal design. And yes, I added with a smile, I've reserved the penthouse apartment for myself. On the drawing table, beside the meticulous plans, was an old photograph of me young and confident, standing before my first major project. Now, that photo was accompanied by a new one, me at 74, equally powerful, finally visible again, not just to others, but primarily to myself. I turned to James, who stood somewhat awkwardly at the edge of the group. The past year had aged him visibly, but there was something new in his eyes, a kind of clarity that hadn't been there before. Your father would be proud of both of us, I said quietly. Me for rebuilding, you for having the courage to face the truth. He nodded, understanding that our relationship would never return to what it was, but perhaps it could become something better, a connection between equals, not a structure built on exploitation and resentment. Happy birthday, Mom, he said, raising his glass, to new foundations. Last week, I gave the keynote address at the National Conference on Accessible Design, something I couldn't have imagined doing a year ago. As I stood at the podium, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the glass. Silver hair, elegantly styled, posture straight, eyes clear and focused. This woman bore little resemblance to the grandmother who had been strategically positioned away from family photos at her son's wedding. That woman had been trained to step back, to provide support without recognition, to give without limits. This woman, the real Margaret Wilson, commanded the room. My work with the Architecture of Life initiative had expanded significantly, with projects now underway in 3 cities. Our partnership with established foundations gave us resources and reach I couldn't have achieved alone in such a short time. Our first housing complex would break ground next month, with innovative features designed specifically for maintaining senior independence. The support group I'd started with Diana had evolved into a formal organization providing legal and financial guidance to seniors facing similar situations. We'd already helped 15 families recover misappropriated assets and rebuild healthy boundaries. James attended the conference, sitting quietly in the back row. Our relationship had found a new equilibrium, not the unquestioning support of before, but something more sustainable. He'd completed his therapy, maintained his sobriety from gambling, and recently started teaching accounting at a community college. The divorce from Amber had been finalized 6 months ago. I'd heard through Boston social circles that she'd already moved on to her next target, this time a widowed judge with considerable family wealth. Her pattern continued, predictable as ever. After my speech, a woman in her 60s approached me, clutching my recent article in Architectural Digest. Your story gave me courage, she said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I've been supporting my adult children for decades while they treat me as nothing more than a bank account. Yesterday, I finally said no. I smiled, recognizing my former self in her nervous determination. The hardest part is already behind you, I told her, squeezing her hand. Now you get to rediscover who you are, beyond what you give to others. That evening, I hosted a small dinner at my home, now a showcase for my renewed creativity. The walls, once covered with diagrams of manipulation, now displayed architectural renderings of upcoming projects. Edward's watch, fully restored, kept perfect time on my wrist. Joseph raised his glass in a toast to Margaret Wilson, who proved it's never too late for a magnificent redesign. As laughter filled the room, I felt Edward's presence strongly, not as a ghost, but as the foundation of confidence he always believed in, even when I couldn't see it myself. Lauren, who had become an unexpected friend and ally through this journey, added her own toast to seeing people for who they truly are, both others and ourselves. Later, alone in my studio, I examined the blueprint for the community center addition I'd designed. The structure was innovative yet practical, beautiful yet functional, much like the new life I'd built from the ruins of betrayal. My phone buzzed with a text from Diana. Reminder, new member joining our support group tomorrow. 78-year-old retired teacher whose grandson has been manipulating her finances. I typed back quickly. I'll bring the blueprint exercise we discussed. Setting down my phone, I ran my fingers over Edward's watch, feeling its steady rhythm against my skin. A reminder that time moves forward, that wounds heal, that strength returns. I'm visible now, I whispered to the empty room that no longer felt empty at all. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.